The man's voice is a raw, grating thing, like stones grinding in a dry creek bed. 30 lashes for the thieving savage, he announces, his words slicing through the thick, anxious air of the dusty trading post clearing. The crowd murmurs, a mix of grim satisfaction and nervous curiosity. A young Lakota woman stands tied to a wagon wheel, her chin high, her dark eyes fixed on the distant, hazy line of the plains that has always been her home. She is impossibly small against the raw timber of the post, a willow sapling in a forest of bitter oaks. This is a place of harsh bargains and harder men, and today, she is the currency of their brutal justice. A trapper named Elias Thorne, his face a roadmap of sun and solitude, watches from the shade of the livery. He sees not a thief, but a cornered animal, and the sight coils something cold and tight in his gut. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The man holding the whip, a bull-necked freighter named Barlow, grins as he tests the leather's bite against his own thigh. He is the self-appointed law in this forsaken outpost, and he savors the fear he creates. Elias knows the girl. He's seen her trading finely beaded moccasins for flour and salt, her movements always quiet and dignified. He doesn't believe for a second she stole the silver locket Barlow claims she did. He believes Barlow is a man who enjoys breaking things. Elias pushes himself off the livery wall, his own quiet life on a remote homestead suddenly feeling like a coward's retreat. He takes a step forward, then another, the dust puffing around his worn boots. He raises a hand, not in protest, but as a simple, unignorable statement. Barlow pauses, annoyed by the interruption. And with 6 words, spoken in a low, steady voice that cuts through the crowd's whispers, Elias's life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. I will take them in her stead. The first lash was a line of pure fire drawn across his back. Elias Thorne gritted his teeth against the shock of it, his hands clenching the rough-sawn wood of the wagon wheel. He'd insisted they tie him in her place. Barlow, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into cruel amusement, had readily agreed. A white man volunteering for a savage's punishment was a spectacle too rich to pass up. The second lash landed before the fire of the first had cooled, crossing it with a fresh agony. He forced his eyes open, focusing on a single nail head in the weathered planks of the trading post wall. He would not give them the satisfaction of a sound. He had spent years alone in the vast, unforgiving silence of the plains and mountains, his only companions the wind and the stars. He knew how to endure. He knew how to be still. He'd arrived at the post for salt, coffee, and a few cartridges, a trip he made twice a year. He preferred the company of his own thoughts to the suspicious glances and rough talk of other men. But when he saw the girl, Winona, her wrists bound, her expression a careful, brittle sculpture of defiance, something inside him shifted. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a stark recognition of injustice, a dissonant chord struck in the quiet harmony of his solitary world. He knew Barlow's kind, men who used strength not to build, but to dominate, who saw anything different as something to be tamed or destroyed. By the 10th lash, the fire had become a searing, liquid pain that radiated through his entire torso. A low groan escaped his lips, swallowed by the grunts of Barlow's effort. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could practically taste their morbid fascination. Through a haze of sweat and dust, he saw her. The Lakota girl. They had untied her, and she stood near the corner of the livery, not running, but watching. Her face was unreadable, a stone carving of stoicism, but her eyes held a darkness that seemed to mirror the pain blooming across his back. 20. The world began to shrink, the edges turning gray and fuzzy. The nailhead he'd been staring at blurred. His focus turned inward, to the rhythm of his own breathing, the thud of his own heart. He thought of his small, lonely cabin, of the creek that ran cold and clear behind it, of the hawk that circled overhead most afternoons. He had built a life of deliberate simplicity, a fortress against the chaos and cruelty of the world he'd left behind. Now he had invited it in. 30. The final blow was a dull, sickening thud. It felt less like a whip and more like a club. A wave of blackness washed over him, and his knees buckled. Barlow, breathing heavily, spat on the ground beside him. "Fool," he grunted, and tossed the blood-slicked leather aside. Two men, their faces impassive, cut Elias's bonds. He slumped against the wheel for a moment before forcing himself to stand, swaying on his feet. He had to get his supplies. He had to get back to his horse. He couldn't show weakness here. He paid for his goods with trembling hands, the storekeeper refusing to meet his eyes. As he loaded the sacks onto his pack horse, he felt a presence behind him. It was her, Winona. She stood a few feet away, her hands clasped before her. She said nothing. Her language was not his. But her eyes, dark and deep as a prairie night, spoke of a debt she did not know how to voice. He simply nodded, a curt, painful gesture, and swung himself into his own saddle. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through him, and the ride home was a long, slow torment. Every jolt of the horse was a new torture, every mile a battle against the encroaching darkness at the edge of his vision. When he finally slid from the saddle at his homestead, he nearly collapsed, crawling the last few feet to his cabin door and falling inside into a heap of pain and exhaustion. He awoke to the smell of wood smoke and something else, something herbal and clean. The sun was streaming through his one-glass window, and for a moment, he was confused. He'd left the fire as cold embers. He tried to sit up, and a bolt of agony shot through him, forcing him back down with a choked gasp. "Be still," a soft voice said. His head turned on the crude pillow. Winona was there, kneeling by his hearth, tending a small, smokeless fire. A pot of water steamed over it. She had come. He had no idea how she had followed him, or why. He was lying on his cot, and he realized with a jolt that his shirt was gone. His back was bare to the cool air of the cabin. She rose and came to his side, carrying a wet cloth and a small wooden bowl containing a greenish paste. Her movements were fluid and economical, filled with a purpose that left no room for hesitation. She met his gaze for only a second, her expression somber, before looking away to dip the cloth in the water. Gently, she began to clean the edges of the deepest cuts on his back. His entire body tensed, but her touch was surprisingly light. The water was cool, and the herbal scent of the paste was calming. He lay there, silent, as she worked. He, a man who had not allowed another human being to touch him in years, was now completely at the mercy of this stranger from a world he did not understand. She cleaned every stripe, her focus absolute. Then, using her fingers, she began to apply the cool, soothing poultice. The relief was immediate, a blessed balm against the fire. They did not speak. There were no words they shared. Yet, in the quiet of the cabin, something was being communicated. Her careful, methodical tending of his wounds was a language all its own. It spoke of gratitude, of respect, of a shared humanity that defied the prejudices of the world outside. When she was finished, she covered his back with a clean piece of linen she must have found in his meager trunk. She offered him a dipper of water, and he drank it greedily. Then, she retreated back to the fire, as silent as a shadow, and began to cook something in his small iron pot. Elias lay back, the pain in his back now a dull, manageable throb, and watched her. The sun moved across the floorboards. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a quiet, wounded girl who was now, for some reason he could not yet fathom, his keeper. The next day brought a new and more profound complication. He was sitting stiffly at his small table, wearing his shirt unbuttoned, when he saw them. 3 riders, approaching not from the direction of the trading post, but from the open plains to the north. They were Lakota. They rode with an innate, unshakable confidence, their posture straight, their gaze sweeping the landscape. They carried lances, and one had an old trade rifle cradled in his arms. Elias felt a prickle of alarm. Winona, who had been outside scraping a hide he'd left to cure, immediately stood and went to his doorway. She watched them approach, her body tense. Elias rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the wall. "No," she said, the single word sharp. She put a hand on his arm, a brief, firm touch. "They are my kin." He relaxed his hand, but did not move away from the weapon. He had dealt with the Lakota before, mostly in brief, cautious trading encounters. He knew them to be honorable but fierce, and he had no idea what to expect. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. The man in the center, older, his face a beautiful, intricate pattern of wrinkles and dignity, dismounted. He was clearly the leader. He looked at Winona, and they exchanged a flurry of words in their own tongue. Her voice was low and melodic, his a resonant baritone. Then, the old man's eyes settled on Elias. He walked forward slowly, his gaze missing nothing: the raw cabin, the neatly stacked woodpile, the man standing in the doorway with pain etched around his eyes. He stopped before Elias and spoke in slow, heavily accented English. "You are the man called Thorn." It was not a question. "I am," Elias said, his voice raspy. "My name is Kengi Sunka. Wolf Coyote. This one," he said, gesturing to Winona, "is my brother's daughter. Her parents walked the spirit road. She is my blood." Elias nodded, waiting. "She has told us what was done. What you did," Kengi Sunka continued, his eyes boring into Elias. "In our way, when a man bleeds for one of our people, a great debt is made. An act of honor cannot be repaid with trinkets or horses. It must be met with honor." Elias remained silent, unsure where this was leading. He had not acted for reward or honor. He had acted because it was the only thing his conscience would allow. "Our world is changing," the old man said, a deep sadness in his voice. "The buffalo dwindle. The iron road cuts our land. Our people are pushed into smaller corners. A woman alone is not safe. What happened at the white man's post will happen again." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet air. "You stood for her. You took her shame and her pain onto your own back. You have shown you have a strong heart, a spirit that is not twisted by hate." He looked from Elias to Winona, who stood beside him now, her eyes on the ground. "We cannot protect her in your world, but you can," Kengi Sunka stated, his voice firm with purpose. "We offer a pact. You will take her as your wife. You will give her the protection of your name and your home. In return, you will have our friendship. My hunters will help fill your stores. My people will not trouble your lands. You will be a friend to the Oglala. This is the honor we offer to meet the honor you have shown." Elias stared, speechless. Wife? The word was alien, something from another life he'd long since buried. He was a man who owned one pot, 2 blankets, and a patch of land no one else wanted. He lived a life pared down to the bone, a life of deliberate emptiness. To bring another person into it, a wife, a Lakota woman he didn't know, it was unthinkable. He looked at Winona. She was watching him now, her expression guarded, revealing nothing of her own feelings. Was this what she wanted? To be tied to a scarred white trapper in a lonely cabin, bartered away to settle a debt of honor? He saw the impossible position she was in. To refuse would be to insult her kin and leave her vulnerable. To accept was to bind herself to a stranger. His back ached with a dull, insistent rhythm, a constant reminder of the choice he had already made. He had stepped into her life, and in doing so, had tangled their fates together. To turn away now, to send her back with them, felt like a betrayal of his own actions. It would leave her unmoored, an object of contention between 2 worlds. He thought of the long, silent winters, of the crushing loneliness he never admitted even to himself. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, the intelligence in her dark eyes. He saw the way she had tended his wounds, with a skill and gentleness that spoke of a deep, innate kindness. Slowly, painfully, Elias Thorn nodded his head. "I accept your pact," he said. The days that followed were a study in quiet adjustment. Winona's kin departed as peacefully as they had arrived, leaving her with a small bundle of her possessions. And just like that, Elias Thorn, the solitary man, was a husband. The cabin, which had always felt spacious enough for one, now seemed crowded with unspoken thoughts and unfamiliar rhythms. Winona moved through his space with a quiet grace that was both unsettling and captivating. She claimed no part of the cabin as her own, yet her presence transformed it. The scent of wild mint and sage began to infuse the air. His haphazard stacks of supplies became neatly organized. The meals, once a simple affair of fried bacon and hardtack, now included wild greens, roots, and savory stews he didn't know the names of. She was a tireless worker, her hands always busy, mending his worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, tanning the hides he brought in with an expertise that shamed his own clumsy efforts, her scraper moving in a hypnotic, rhythmic dance. Language was the highest barrier. They communicated through gestures, through pointing, through a handful of shared words. Water, fire, good, he would watch her, trying to understand the world behind her eyes. He learned that the first light of dawn was a sacred time for her, a time of silent prayer facing the east. He learned she could read the weather in the flight of birds and the shape of the clouds. She, in turn, learned the particularities of his own quiet life. She learned he liked his coffee black and strong, that he had a habit of carving small, intricate animals from scraps of wood in the evenings, and that the scars on his back were not the only ones he carried. There was a sadness in his eyes she recognized, a loneliness that mirrored her own. One evening, he returned from checking his trap lines to find her sitting outside the cabin, staring at the vast, star-dusted sky. He sat down near her on the porch step, the ache in his back a familiar companion. For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the crickets and the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass. "Wichapi," she said softly, pointing upwards. "Stars," he replied, his voice low. She nodded, then pointed to a specific constellation he knew as the Hunter's Belt. She said a word in Lakota, her voice like music. He repeated it, stumbling over the sounds. A small smile, the first he had ever seen from her, touched her lips. It was a fleeting thing, but it lit her face like a sudden sunrise. In that moment, the cabin felt a little less small, the silence a little less heavy. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. Elias was splitting wood when he saw the riders, Barlow and 2 of his cronies from the trading post. They rode into his homestead with an arrogant swagger, their horses trampling the small patch of herbs Winona had been cultivating near the door. "Thorn," Barlow called out, his voice thick with contempt. "Heard you got yourself a squaw wife. Getting a taste for brown meat, are we?" Elias set his axe down slowly, deliberately. He walked to stand in front of his cabin door, placing himself between them and the entrance. Winona was inside. He could feel her presence, a still, watchful energy. "This is my land, Barlow," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "State your business or ride out." Barlow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My business is that thieving bitch you're hiding. We let you play the fool and take her lashing, but that don't make her innocent. She's a vagrant, a menace. We've come to take her to the fort where she belongs. They'll know what to do with her." "She's my wife," Elias said, the words feeling both strange and powerful on his tongue. "She's not going anywhere." "Wife," Barlow sneered, looking at his companions for approval. "You ain't got no paper from a preacher. You're just shacked up with a savage. That don't mean nothing in the eyes of the law." He made to dismount, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. Elias didn't move. He simply stood there, his body a solid, unyielding barrier. He was unarmed, save for the axe that lay 10 feet away. But there was something in his eyes, a cold, hard certainty, that gave Barlow pause. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had already made his peace with violence. "You touch my door, Barlow," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "and I will tear you apart with my bare hands. I don't care what happens to me after. You ride out now, or you find out if I'm bluffing." The 2 men with Barlow shifted uneasily in their saddles. They were bullies, not killers, and they hadn't signed on for a fight to the death with a man who looked like he meant every word he said. Barlow stared at Elias, his face mottled with rage and frustration. He was used to men cowering. This quiet defiance infuriated him. "This ain't over, Thorn," he snarled, reining his horse around sharply. "You and your pet Indian. The good people around here won't stand for it." They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a tense, ringing silence. Elias stood for a long moment, his fists still clenched, before he turned and went inside. Winona was standing by the hearth, a skinning knife clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. She had been ready to fight. He went to her and gently took the knife from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. It was an anchor in the storm, that brief contact. He realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that Barlow was right. A Lakota pact meant nothing in a white man's world. She wasn't safe. Their home wasn't a fortress, it was a target. And the fear he felt was not for himself, but for her. The thought of losing her, of them taking her, was a physical pain worse than any whip. The visit from Barlow changed everything. The quiet comfort they had begun to build was now laced with a constant, simmering anxiety. Elias started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, even just to the creek. Winona grew more withdrawn, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The trust they had been carefully, silently weaving was now being tested by the threat from the outside world. Elias knew he had to do something more. A pact made on the plains was not enough. He needed a pact that Barlow and his kind would be forced to recognize. One evening, as they ate their meal in silence, he made his decision. "Tomorrow," he said, speaking slowly so she would understand, "we ride to the fort." She looked at him, her expression questioning. The fort was a place of soldiers, of the very power that was crushing her people. It was a place of danger. "Preacher," he said, touching his own chest, then hers. He made a ring with his thumb and forefinger. "Wife, a paper." Her eyes widened in understanding. He was talking about a Christian marriage, a white man's ceremony. It was a formal binding, a legal shield. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. Was it fear? Relief? Resignation? She simply nodded. The ride to Fort Laramie was long and tense. Elias was acutely aware of the stares they drew as they rode. He, the scarred recluse, and she, the beautiful Lakota woman, an anomaly that invited suspicion and scorn. At the fort, he found the traveling chaplain, a weary-eyed man named Reverend Miller, who looked at them with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "You want to marry this woman?" Miller asked, his gaze lingering on Winona's traditional deerskin dress. "She is my wife," Elias stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I want the paper that says so." The ceremony was a bleak, hurried affair, conducted in a dusty supply room with 2 bored soldiers as witnesses. The Reverend mumbled the words, his heart clearly not in it. When he asked Elias for the ring, Elias took a simple iron nail from his pocket, one he had spent the previous night filing and bending into a crude circle. He slid it onto Winona's finger. Her hand was steady in his. When Miller pronounced them man and wife, nothing felt different, yet everything had changed. He had a piece of paper, signed and stamped, a flimsy shield against a world of hate. On the ride back, a strange sense of finality settled over him. He had tied himself to her not just with honor, but with law. He looked over at her, riding silently beside him, the crude iron ring stark against her brown skin. He felt a surge of fierce, desperate protectiveness. She was his responsibility. She was his. They arrived back at the cabin as dusk was painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. And they were not alone. Barlow was there, and this time he had 4 men with him. And they weren't just sitting on their horses. They had a rope, and they had thrown it over the highest branch of the cottonwood tree that stood in his yard. "Evening, Thorn," Barlow called out, his voice slick with mock pleasantry. "We heard you went to the fort. Trying to make your savage respectable?" He spat. "It don't work like that. You've cast your lot with them, and there's a price for being a race traitor." Elias slid from his horse, pulling his rifle from its scabbard in one smooth motion. "Get off my land, Barlow." "I don't think so," Barlow said, nodding to the noose hanging ominously in the twilight. "We're going to teach you and anyone else who gets friendly with the Redskins a lesson about how things are done out here. We'll deal with her after you're swinging." Elias cocked the rifle. "The first one of you who takes another step dies." But before anyone could move, another sound drifted on the evening air. It was a low chant, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. On the ridge overlooking the homestead, figures appeared. First 1, then 3, then 10, then more. They were on horseback, warriors in paint, their lances catching the last rays of the sun. It was Kangisunka and his hunters. They sat on their horses, silent and watchful, a line of silent judgment against the sky. Barlow and his men froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of this new threat. They were 5 men with pistols. They were now facing dozens of Lakota warriors who had appeared as if from nowhere. The standoff was absolute. The air was thick enough to choke on. Then, Winona dismounted. She walked past Elias and stood in the open space between the 2 groups. She turned not to her kin, but to Barlow. "This man," she said, her voice clear and strong, her English broken but firm. She pointed to Elias. "He has honor. He is my husband." She held up her left hand, displaying the crude iron ring. "This paper," she said, tapping the marriage license tucked in Elias's shirt pocket, "is your way. My people," She swept a hand toward the warriors on the ridge. Are my way. We are one. You touch him, you touch all of us. Her voice did not tremble. She stood, no longer the frightened girl at the wagon wheel, but a woman of immense strength, bridging two worlds with her own courage. She was defending him. Kangi Sunka let out a single, sharp cry from the ridge, and it was echoed by all his warriors. It was not a war cry. It was a cry of affirmation, of solidarity. Barlow looked from the unwavering barrel of Elias's rifle to the stone-faced woman before him, and then to the terrifying, silent line of warriors on the ridge. The color drained from his face. The fight was over before it had even begun. He had been defeated not by force of arms, but by a force of will he could not comprehend. "Let's go," he muttered to his men, his voice a choked whisper. They turned their horses and rode away, not with a gallop, but with the defeated slump of men who knew they had crossed a line and had been met with something far stronger than their own petty hatred. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, the warriors on the ridge melted back into the plains as silently as they had appeared. Elias lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from adrenaline. He looked at Winona, who was still standing in the yard, her posture proud and unyielding. The setting sun haloed her in gold. The pact made of blood and honor had been tested by fire, and it had held. He walked to her, and for the first time, he reached out and took her hand, the one with the iron ring. Her fingers curled around his, warm and strong. They stood together in the gathering dark, the hanging rope a forgotten ghost against the twilight sky. The cabin behind them was no longer just his shelter. It was their home, a small island of courage in a vast and hostile land. Looking at her face, her eyes reflecting the first stars, he knew the 30 lashes had been the best bargain he had ever made. He had taken them for a stranger, and in return, she had given him back a part of his soul he thought he had lost forever. He watches her now, humming a quiet tune as she mends his shirt by the firelight. The crude iron ring on her finger catches the flickering light, a small, constant star in the warmth of their home. Her Lakota kin visit sometimes, bringing gifts of smoked meat and leaving with coffee and tobacco, their silent friendship a bulwark against the world. The people at the trading post mostly leave them be, their fear and hatred having been replaced by a grudging, wary respect. He reaches out, and his fingers gently trace the intricate pattern of her stitches. She looks up and smiles, not the fleeting, hesitant smile of their first weeks, but a deep, knowing one that reaches her eyes. In this quiet, shared life, forged in pain and sealed with courage, the lonely trapper and the displaced maiden found more than just safety. They found a language that needed no words, a pact that became a bond, and a home on a wild frontier that belonged only to them. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.